Michael came out subsequently, and before he came out, his mother was very worried about it. So she went around to the village and got silver from 50 Marias. And he had this cross made out of it. Of course, survived. Did he go to war? I'm not sure. Became a tailor. And his daughter became the headmistress of English at one of the private schools. And that's very challenging when you get bigger and new people come into play, of not losing what the heart of it really is. So, but it's a great thing, because Rob, the truth is, I don't need another shirt in life. Any of the dollars I pick up, I might as well go there, in a nutshell.
It's a beautiful thing when you allow people to share their story, to have their voice heard, because suddenly, that marginalisation becomes a little bit smaller, doesn't it?
So I was born white, loving parents who believed in education, the benefit of all that. And then, of course, subsequently marrying someone of Indian descent, born in Singapore to Indian parents.
G'day and welcome to Global Horizons. I'm your host, Rob Malicki, coming to you today from Garigal Land in Sydney. And I got to say, I couldn't be happier today to be talking with the guests that I've got lined up for you, because he's a total legend in Australian international education. In fact, Australian higher education. And as I bring him in, I'm so chuffed about this, because if there is one person in Australian higher education who's got a perfect voice for podcasts, it's my guest today, John Wood.
Nice to be
Welcome
here,
to the
Rob.
podcast.
My children often say I've got the face for broadcasting or something like that. I never quite understand it. Anyhow.
The perfect face for radio, they say. I think we've all got that, haven't we? No, mate, I've got to say, what I love, John, and is you have the perfect voice that's defined as mellifluous. You have this wonderful tone of voice, and I just love
thanks,
it.
Rob. It's a different thing of what I've got to say.
The
I'm a little
mellifluous
hoarse
tones
at the moment as a result of some medication, but that's a whole other question. Okay, Rob, fire away.
Maybe we can get started, John. It's 1985, and you're in the office next door to the Prime Minister, Bob Hawke.
We can.
And
it's interesting, Rob, of how I got there. I was in the state public service. I'd been seconded to work on an economic strategy for WA. I went to Canberra to brief EPAC, the Economic Planning Advisory Council. That same day, someone said, look, Hawke's going to be looking for a new economic advisor and a speechwriter. Various people were going. You interested? And I said, well, maybe. Yeah, why not? So went over, met Bob. I'd met him only once before. And then a week later, I'm having lunch at the lodge with him and the gang of four, Garno, Barron, Hogg, etc. And then I'm there till the end of 86. My choice to come back to Perth, you've got a taste of that, been there, done that. But when I look back on it, I'm in my early 30s, I think, pretty unique experience. And also Bob said, look, why did you go across to Prime Minister and Cabinet? So I then had an experience of the transition to the leadership under Mike Codd of Prime Minister and Cabinet, as well as, of course, the very unique experience of literally being a door away from Hawke, who was very disciplined at that stage. He ran a great cabinet in terms of the chair of the board. And I happened to be there when the decision was made to allow universities to charge full fees for international students. So little did I know, and little did the cabinet members know, what that would mean for Australia. And I know that John Hawkins is rightly credited and others with it, but Hawke understood it. He got it. His interest was threefold. He felt the universities had enough money. They should manage themselves better. That was the first point. Secondly, we needed to engage much more in the Asian region of the world. And thirdly, the rising per capita income, particularly of the then Tigers, meant that they could afford higher international education. I mean, he understood and got it, and he kind of had a sense of what it might mean for Australia. But none of them had any idea, really, of what subsequently would grow to be a very significant contributor to not just the economy, but of course to society.
Did you have any inkling that it would become this amazing contributor
Well,
to our
I
entire
did
nation?
have an inkling that it would grow beyond what was expected, and that was perhaps based upon a commitment on a view on my part twofold. One, the aspiration that so many people in the region, I'm thinking of wanting international study, and I was aware, of course, that Malaysia had become such a key source of international students for the UK. And you could argue, why was Malaysia significant? Well, pretty simply, because there was a racist policy in Malaysia. If you were Chinese, you were discriminated against. Chinese, a great belief in education. So it was providing the UK. And if I'm not mistaken, they'd introduced international fees under Thatcher, I think a bit earlier. Question mark, Rob. So I had a sense, and as an aside, subsequently, I know I'm jumping, but when I was at Navitas, Ted Evans, who was the Secretary of the Commonwealth Treasury when I was there, and who Paul Keating wanted to head Prime Minister and Cabinet rather than a guy named Mike Cott. A long tale I could tell about, my observation at the time. But Ted and I would always sit at the board meetings, Navitas board meetings together, and we'd talk about the Hawke Keating years. Ted had a view that by the middle of this century, Australia's largest export, if we had it in us, would actually be international education. I said, Ted, how can you say that when we've got iron ore and coal? He said, they're declining industries one day, John, if Australia's big and bold enough. And so we used to have discussions about what's wrong with a university that might have all international students. We had some interesting discussion, Ted and I, but I guess what I'm saying, here's someone whose life was a senior public servant, a very considered man who actually could see that international education in a new world was terribly significant as a contributor to not just the economy, to society.
What a fascinating story, right? And I look back at that period, and it was a period of transformational government. If you look at what Keating and Hawke, between their two prime ministerships, delivered in terms of economic changes and management, international education, I mean, the list is enormous. Yeah, it almost feels like that was almost the last time that we really had government that was fearless about major reform, and not just a one-off thing, but across so many different fronts.
The sheer competence of ministers, be they Joe Dawkins, Neil Blewett, Ralph Willis in his own ways, Gareth Evans. I mean, on we go. Susan Ryan, of course, was the Minister for Education. She was hesitant about the international. But Rob, a story, I'm not quite sure how I'll edit the language. Effectively, they were the days when the AVCC used to kind of operate on a consensus model. So they were aware that the government was going to move to charge full fees international students. There were two universities holding out. So we had less universities in the AVCC. The Dawkins reforms hadn't kind of kicked in terms of the growth of universities. And there were two universities holding out. I'm mighty tempted to ask, any idea who they might be?
I don't know.
One was Sydney, one was Melbourne. Hawke came down, various negotiations. Hawke said, you ring those fucking vice chancellors, and if they bloody don't agree, they're not getting the Commonwealth grants. Stuff them. So isn't this supremely ironic? I mean, we could put that another way. Well, for purposes of editing. Well, there were two universities that actually were not supportive. It happened to be the University of Melbourne and the University of Sydney. We should not charge these fees. We shouldn't go down this route. Well, Rob, look where we're at now. You can argue that they've become drunk on it and they've received huge income. They've, in my view, misallocated that money. They've been over-dependent upon one key source country at their cost and Australia's cost. So, riddled with irony, Rob, the fact that our two oldest universities, one was established in 1850, the other in 1856, were holding out a reform that they subsequently, if you like, benefited financially enormously from. Very unique experience for me to observe all that, and had no idea then that I would one day be a DVC of International, that I have the joy of working alongside Rod Jones and other colleagues, for 11 years to really, drive and be part of a massive Australian success story.
I'm really excited to get to that part of the story, but perhaps by way of getting there, just before we started recording, you said you were from a working class background. Tell us a little bit about that journey to, from the beginning through to the Prime Minister's, next door to the Prime Minister's office.
Rob, to think of that. Dad was a baker, but came out from Scotland. Nice. I guess forced over here because he needed work or whatever. Mum was born in Greenbushes, pretty humble origins. But of course, they had great drive, enormous drive. And they believed in the value of education. Dad used to say, "Don't be a mug like me, make your money with your coat on." Well, he wasn't a mug, but I guess what he was stressing is the power of education. And my brother Mike, 8 years older than I, was first in family to go to university. I was a pretty ordinary student. I mean, at one stage, I think when I was 15, Mum was a bit worried and I should become a carpenter or something like that and be a tradesperson. I hung in there, but when I got to uni, I didn't get a com scholl. I just got my 7 subjects and 4 matric as you needed. But then I thought, I fell in love with economic history and I became very disciplined as a student. And then of course, the end of my first year, I get a letter from Reg Appleyard, the prof of the department. I'd come back, I was brickies labouring. God, I was bloody fit, Rob. I was I was so healthy and I worked hard. I love working for the 3 Italian guys. I love getting cash at the end of the day. I liked their energy and all of that. And I'd never heard of honours. I didn't really know about Oxford. And so Reg said, "Look, John, we'd like you to do honours." And he became insistent that I really should have do postgrad. And then, of course, a series of events, I find myself, getting a scholarship to Oxford, where I had a pretty unique experience in that I went to I was doing postgrad. I actually went to an undergraduate college, Exeter, third oldest. And when I look back on it, I mean, there was a lot of pale-faced English guys that were there and not a lot of humanities. I had some great friendships developed and have remained. But I then somehow or rather went from that undergraduate college. I was as a graduate student, and I went down to Nuffield. And Exeter was a very old established college, very large. Nuffield was established by Lord Nuffield, i.e. William Morris, as he wanted an engineering college, and Oxford gave him a very elite social science college of about 40 students and 40 fellows. So it was very small and unique. And I had, that's where I, did my doctorate. And of course, along the way, Jeff Geller and I became great friends. I'd known Jeff briefly in Perth, but then of course our friendship was extended in Oxford. And of course, Jeff was Tony Blair's best man. So, I was introduced to another world. And then of course, I had opportunities I was a teaching fellow at one of the Oxford colleges. I had various postdocs lined up at elite institutions. But I just woke up one morning, bloody cold, and said to my wife, "We're coming back to Australia." So we did, and she was been very tolerant of me all along the way. So, and that began the journey back to Oz. So I guess I had a decade, if you like, Rob, as the young scholar and historian of thought, conceived the critical assessments of great economists, which was a collection of articles, not but by various great economists. Kept that going, would you believe, for 40 years, editing it. And
wow.
I did that in my other role, and I put together the idea with a British publisher, Christopher Helm, and a Japanese book agent, Sumio Sato. And I could wax all to well, I don't know what it is, Rob. I could go on about it forever, about what that was, how it came about, what we did, and so on. But that's another subject of a long discussion.
What was it like to be in Oxford? I mean, Oxford, the town, as opposed to Oxford, the university. In Oxford during that period, to me, when I think about it, I sort of imagine that must have been one of the pinnacle moments in terms of just intellectual opportunity. Before institutions got driven by so many other priorities, but the opportunity just to sort of engage in that intellectual discovery.
A couple of comments, Rob. I was pretty unusual And do you know that they couldn't find a PhD, DPhil as they call it, supervisor for me? So I went to a guy named Peter Mathias, who wrote a book on the first industrial revolution, I think. I've got the title wrong, Rob. I'll have to remember it and edit it back. Anyhow, he was at All Souls College, which was just only fellows. So Peter took me under his wing, but there was no one who felt equipped. I was working in the history of economic thought, specifically British economists in the empire. I wanted to know, did economists of the time have any influence on economic policy? After about 3 weeks, I realised they didn't, but I still had to get a PhD or a DPhil. So, of course, he then organised for a beautiful man, A.W. Coates, Bob Coates, who was up at Nottingham. So I had an external supervisor, which meant I was a bit different anyway, Rob. So that's the first point. Secondly, Exeter College, where they'd wanted me to tutor immediately. I'd been tutoring at UWA for a year. I wanted a break from that. So I guess I didn't kind of put it up the establishment, but that was expected, but I didn't do that. And when I went down to Nuffield, I then became part of a much more involved community, if you like, not just of economists, but of social sciences. And that covered politics and sociology. Interestingly enough, there was a student rep on the governing body at Nuffield, and there was a left candidate and a right candidate. They couldn't agree. Someone said, John, just stick your hand up. The other two guys dropped out. So I got elected unopposed. Easiest way. But that meant I'd had dinner with Callaghan, Willie Whitelaw. He got pissed with me one night. All these guys. So that was a pretty unique interplay, not between that Oxbridge world, if you like, or the world of government and the link back to Oxford, particularly Nuffield.
What do you reckon your parents would think about all that? You know, about where you've ended up, and maybe this is a question I should be asking at the end of the podcast, but it just sort of occurs to me now. You know, Jeff Gallup, obviously huge figure here in Australian politics. Tony Blair goes on to become Prime Minister of England and everything. And you know, your folks come from sort of humble background, so to speak, self-made, that sort of thing. Yeah, what do you think that they would?
I think they'd be mighty proud, Rob. You know, beginning into it, and also that hard work. I mean, I don't know how Dad, as a baker, paid for us to go to boarding school. I just don't know how he did it. You know, I mean, and Mum and her dedication to hard work. So I think they'd be so proud.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Like I sometimes think this, John, that almost the most important thing you can instill in your kids, and clearly your parents did it with you, is the ability to work hard. You know, because you end up we all end up in strife at some point. But if you've got a good work ethic, you can work your way through.
I wasn't a brilliant student. I just worked very hard. I became smart at actually reading what the exam questions would be. You know, I was tenacious in my doctorate because it's a long and complicated tale, Rob. I got referred, meaning my DPhil was really path-breaking. Bob Coates thought it was. The two examiners, and there's a whole history about how that came about. So they weren't happy. I was given a choice of a lower degree or rewrite. I rewrote in a traditional way. Took me another year or so. Then there was a dispute. I was teaching. Stanford flew me back to teach. I used to teach for Stanford in Britain at Clifton House, where the Perfumo affair happened, and Christine Keeler and all that stuff. So, you know, I developed a course, Britain from Dominance to Decline, and used to teach that. It was a way of getting a bit of extra cash. But they flew me back. I needed to be back in London for potentially a second viva. Lo and behold, that didn't happen, which meant I actually automatically had the degree. There was a dispute at council, and David Butler, who used to come to Australia as a commentator on political, you know, the politics of it all. So he said, John, I've just left a social sciences board. Are you willing to be on the front page of the Times tomorrow about what's happened to you? I said, blood oath. If these means my doctorate. So 2 new examiners for the second right were appointed de novo of new, meaning they didn't know anything about what has gone on. They thought the rewrite was brilliant. End of story. So that's all about, I think, a determination of, and both an experimentation in a way under Bob Coates because it was I took a guy named Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which was the order of the day, and applied it to the history of thought, which had never really been done before. Anyhow, but that meant, Rob, when I came to be at Notre Dame, and helping influence policies, and also at ECU, you have 3 examiners. You don't have 2. You've got to have they've got to return within a certain amount of time. Either you sack them, write them into the rules. So it kind of those experiences. The average bloody time for finishing a doctorate at Oxford at that time was about 7 years. The referral rate in economics, in other words, people who didn't complete the degree or get their doctorate was in economics was about 45%. I was not going to be one of those. But Rob, to talk about what the Oxford experience was, it's a little different for me. I didn't live in college. I lived initially in a graduate college, but people said, and Caroline, my wife to be, we were going to get married in the UK. And so, I mean, we needed to do that because she was going to go back to study and all sorts of things. People said, you never get a house to bloody find. Well, I thought I'm going to find a house because accommodation is really hard. And Eric Warner, a man who's a great note in English literature, and I had become friends. And I happened to be meeting him at a library where he was working. And I looked at this Oxford Today magazine, house to rent in, out of town. So I rang up. I say, who's that? I said, it's John Wood here. I said, come out and meet me. There was a lady named Elizabeth Spalding. They were a 4-mile cycle ride out of Oxford on the hill, the Shotover, which was called Shotover because it used to be the road to London where the highwaymen, the robbers would hang out. So they had a 25-acre estate, as in Spalding tennis rackets, family. So I met Elizabeth and we met, and she had one question for me, which I didn't quite understand at the time. Was I going to go back to Australia? I said, absolutely. I want to contribute to Australian life. Why would I stay in Britain? So they had what was called, there was a cottage, well, it was the orchard. So we lived at the Ridings, the orchard, Headington Oxon, and about 1.5 acres of land in a house that was built in the 1920s by the Spaldings for a Russian emigre, and Kenneth Clark of Civilization happened to live in it. It was bloody cold and freezing and unfurnished. We had other students live with us. And of course, Elizabeth and the family, they lived up on this massive manor house that they divided into 4. So it was pretty idyllic living. I mean, I had a really good vegetable patch, questionable whether I went in or out. And of course, I hate to think of the number of Australians that visited us. I think in our first year there, about 120 odd people came through the house. So it wasn't an Oxford college, but it was nonetheless. And of course, when I needed to get a few other people in, and 2 people I met at Exeter College who've become lifelong friends, Dominic Tilsley, from a Cockney from East End, London, eldest of 7 kids. Lo and behold, he's now Sir Dominic Tilsley. Despite being a Republican, he decided to accept the knighthood. He became and is one of the world's leading, I could never understand. He just said, I'm in the physical state, John. He was kind of a mathematician as applied to chemistry. We're the deepest of friends today. So great friendships were established in that world, Rob. So my experiences were, if you like, stepping back from it, a pretty interesting year. I didn't live in. I saw an undergraduate college. I then had the very unique experience of a postgraduate college where, as it happened, Jeff returned to, and then Gallup, and then meeting people there who've gone on to pretty significant places in government and public life. And then, of course, that dimension of living really very close to nature, cultivated nature, in Oxford. So looking back on it, you're not aware at the time of just what that means. You don't appreciate connections. And thinking of connections, Rob, which about 6 months before I left Oxford, I met a guy named Beau Jones. Beau had been finishing a doctorate in history. I sort of knew he'd done a bit of law before. wonderful American guy, bit older than me. Lo and behold, years later, we're taking the family to the States. I'm staying at the Watergate Hotel. I ring Bo up. It was very cheap then. I said, Bo, I'm in the Washington. I said, come out, John. I've got the kids here. So we went. He insisted we come out. It was only a couple of years later that I learned, because he's the opposite of, let's just say, some of the ugly leaders in America today. Very humble. His father worked for Kennedy. Bo used to play tennis at the White House, and he was a Rhodes Scholar along with Clinton, and he ended up becoming the legal counsel for the Washington Post. So when I dropped in, I knew nothing about Bo, about this. I dropped in to see him once I think it must have been an ECU trip somewhere. And anyhow, he said, come to the Washington Post. Bob Woodward's in town, John. So I met and had a chat to Bob. And so and then I'd had Thanksgiving with Bo and all that. And he flagged with me that Kaplan were interested in acquiring IBT long time ago, because they decided that the newspaper business, this is i.e. the Washington Post, needed another stream because they could see where newspapers were heading. So they bought Kaplan. Then they started looking around at one of the most successful acquisitions. And so you may or may not know the Navitas journey, or the IBT journey, partly started when they were approached by Kaplan to buy. And they didn't sell, they publicly listed. So there you go, Rob. So I'm over the strings there. But I guess what am I coming back to? That experience of having been in Oxford, in the environment, being out there with people, the entrepreneurship, and kind of making of it there. And of course, I happened to be there as, again, another little tale. Kim Beazley lived opposite. I knew Kim a little, not much. And Kim lived opposite where I was staying in a graduate house for 3 months in Iffley Road. Of course, the whole Whitlam world was, Whitlam's government was imploding. I knocked on Kim's door. I said, Kim, what's going on? He said, oh, Dad's just been on the phone. Goff's calling a half-Senate election. Well, of course, he was. And then the next morning, Dominic Tilsley, the guy I mentioned, oh, John, they've sacked the Governor-General sacked the Prime Minister. And he was always taking the piss with me, mucking around. I said, oh, come on, Dom. Well, of course, it was true. So, and in Britain at the time, there was outrage. They could not believe that we would, a Governor-General, i.e. the Queen, or the Queen's representative, would sack a Prime Minister. So, again, Rob, one of those things that, just those coincidences, I guess. Yeah, so there you go.
You've opened so many doors there, John. I'm starting to wonder which one I should walk through. But it seems to me maybe you're actually a closet espionage spy, because you keep showing up at all these moments in history with key players. Who's the common thread underneath? I'm wondering if it's one John Wood here. Mate. Where do we go? You've raised Navitas, so maybe let's go there. For those people that know nothing of the Navitas journey, because there's a lot of different people listen to this podcast. People who've been in the industry a long time, people who are relatively recent. So for people who know Navitas but don't know any of the backstory. Can we give them the quick version of how that all started?
I think, Rob,
I think it's remarkable. It's a remarkable
It is remarkable, story. But perhaps just give it a little bit of context. So I come back from Canberra. Yep. Life's pretty dull in the public service. I become Ernst & Young's chief economist. A great job comes back up in government, running its department. I run that. Then I get a phone call from Peter Tannick, whom I've never met, who really drove the creation of Notre Dame. So I go down to Notre Dame as the foundation, the first professorial appointment they'd made, and it was like I was being appointed a professor at Notre Dame. Anyhow, and so I run the business school and end up, being in the executive there. Bit small for me. And of course, around that time, why I mention it, I started watching the emergence of PIBT, from a distance. And I thought, that's very interesting, particularly when Notre Dame was very small, and it was also taking students who they needed assistance, I guess, to get into the market. So I was watching them a little, And I'd met Peter briefly. I knew of Rod, but that was it. And then I go to ECU as the
This is
Peter
Peter
Ross and
Larson
Rod Jones.
and
I
Rod
go
Jones
to
for those
ECU
people.
as
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
PVC, then the DVC International, which of course meant the world of PIBT. And they would proudly come up with a check, a royalty check. And I thought, this is just a nice, brilliant business. But more than a business, they had an absolute commitment to quality to students. Now, the way that came about, Rod had moved into international recruitment through XM, I think, a government agency. He'd met Pete when Pete was working, I think, as perhaps in curricula or the like, through the Secondary Education Authority. They'd gone and worked and Pete had gone off and done his PhD, I think, in the US. And Rod had, I guess, being the entrepreneurial is, he'd worked for Alexander College and Barry Gregory. So he got a taste of what he could see the potential. He could see the potential, particularly for those students who were capable but were not necessarily succeeding or not quite getting into uni. And then, of course, and he'd be the first to say this, they got the model from InSearch, UTS InSearch. They kind of copied that. Gregory and Folk, Barry Gregory couldn't see the vision. Rod, I guess, put everything on the line. Felt he needed academic leadership too to help him. So he entices Pete. It goes, if Rod tells the story, and I've heard him, it might be 5, 6, 7, but it went to ECU's council maybe about 3 times or thereabouts. So it was a long process. And Rod, of course, needed some funds to get started, very hard to find. So they got approval. And the idea was simple, wasn't it, really? Its brilliance is its simplicity. Let's take students who don't quite get direct entry. We'll teach them in foundation stroke. And the brilliance was the equivalent of the first year. I think it started just with business. We'll do an extra class. We'll teach them intensely, and they'll be ready to progress through to second year. And so the university and we will pay the university a royalty arrangement. It'll be based upon the fact that we're using your label, i.e. ECU. Secondly, the curriculum. And thirdly, the facilities. So it was low risk to the extent that they didn't have to build facilities. You could always find accommodation at universities, despite what they'll tell you, particularly on a Friday afternoon or whatever. And so you didn't need big administrative offices. You needed really good teaching space. As soon as that was approved, Rod got on the plane. I think it was 154 students, so he'd have the exact number. So bang, they were off and running. And then, of course, that aftercare for students, that excellent teaching, that total commitment to it, of student support, and getting students up to the level that would enable them to succeed. And then, of course, so as Perth Institute of Business and Technology, I guess Rod was the real driver for expansion. He could see that Sydney and Melbourne were where international students really were. So hence the arrangement, Deakin on the one hand and Macquarie on the other, and then subsequently Brisbane and QIBT, and then SAIBT in South Australia. So that essential, and then of course subsequently expanding beyond business to other areas and progressively over the years. And then of course they started taking in domestic students. It wasn't just international. And then of course they moved to the UK with Hertfordshire and Brunel. Then of course along the way, well, of course I'm repeating, of course, Rob, as I'm thinking of all of this, I'm off course. And along the way, then there's this value being, I knew that this was an extraordinary business, but it was a business based upon a focus on the students and ensuring you set them up for success. And then, of course, the agents and Rod along the way. There are agents today who are now extremely successful that started with Rod, have maintained a loyalty for decades and decades, and of course had a rate of charge, that an agent fee that reflects the great sense of loyalty to them, and delivery. So Rod's for And it was establishment of partnerships. Of course, you have the arrangement where Kaplan approached them to buy. So Rod, Peter Larson and Peter Campbell. Peter Campbell was involved in MIBT. They go to meet Jonathan Grangler, the guy in New York. Didn't like him, partly because I think he only had one bottle of wine. It was the second most expensive restaurant in New York or whatever. Rod tells a great tale about that. But then of course, for the few founders, I mean, there was a big number put on the table, but they didn't want to be an American company. It would have been easy to really a very easy route, sell, perhaps be locked in for 2 or 3 years. But lo and behold, you could argue they went a harder route in the short term, publicly listed. And then, of course, and I joined them. Peter moved on, and I came in, I guess, about 11. They were still IBT, and then the transition to Navitas. And so I was part of that, I guess, global expansion, working hand in glove with Rod, and which took us, of course, to the Canada had just started, but expansion in the UK, some challenges in the US, the bedding down of the creation of my time there at Curtin Singapore. We had Kenya and Zambia as pathways and a little bit of, associate degrees. We put a huge energy into that. The university couldn't see I don't think, the longer term potential. They'd have a different view now. So it was, for me, the most wonderful journey, Rob. And of course, its great success was the absolute commitment to the staff there. And I think in many ways, the way people underestimated the humility and style of Rod. I was forever watching vice chancellors and others who just underestimated the ability to deliver, to make sure it was a win-win-win for everyone, and to never ever compromise on questions of quality or integrity. So great to be around that, because I've worked with university leaders who are the excellent, the good, the bad, the ugly, and the exploitive. So it was those 11 years of my working life, my part of my working life anyway, I'm still working, Rob, was those 11 years alongside, and some great colleagues developed, because in a way, the early colleges were almost like family businesses. They were, the way the rewards came about, the kind of proximity to students, the challenges of it all. And there were many. I mean, some universities were complaining about, these international students come through us and their English is no good and all that. Well, we initiated tracer studies, very comprehensive. Have a guess. They're students, Australian students, non-English speaking background, who were getting into the university with not quite the right levels. So it was forever, and remains so, I suspect, an education program to educating universities of what we were doing or what Navitas is doing. So it's the most extraordinary story, Rob, really.
And amazing to see now how that model is now
absolutely.
everywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, it might have been created somewhere else, but the way that it's now been perpetuated everywhere is very much Navitas, isn't it? Where did the name come from? Out of curiosity,
I arrived, and there was the effort to kind of create the name. Yeah. So we had we appoint a brand company. I reckon a couple of people at Navitas would still know the name. So we wanted something with gravitas, navigate your way. And Rob, check this out. I think I'm right. Got to check my facts, by the way, because, sometimes I don't get it right. After registering the name, would you believe in Canada, there was a bloody Navitas in some province somewhere? Did we try to buy the name? I can't remember how it was resolved. So despite all the expenditure on brand, bloody this, that, the other, tell you what, those brand agencies do very well, Rob. You can spend a lot of money on them. When I was with Ernst & Young, because when I joined Ernst & Young for those couple of years, they were Ernst & Winnie. and then they merged with Arthur Young. So they engaged at massive expenditure, an international brand consultancy, and of course they came up with the Ernst & Young logo. I had a guy working with me. God, he was hard, but he was bright. He was super clever on, the whole IT world, which was just starting. He was a difficult bloke to manage. And he came in and said, John, this is outrageous. Look at this. He said, look at this logo. I said, well, what's wrong with it? He said, hold it up to a mirror. The logo for Ernst & Young, which you put in a mirror, read lie, L-I-E. And I think only someone who
Wow.
is right out there, seeing things very differently. That's why I said he was difficult, because he was so clever and unusual. So he was it. So there
Yeah,
you go,
wow.
Rob. I don't know whether they did anything about that. I think they've modified it a bit, but no, so anyhow. So no, that was and then that
Isn't
began a pretty interesting debate within Navitas, because there was an effort, well, let's call it Navitas at Deakin, Navitas at this. Well, actually, no. I mean, I had a very clear view on that. They weren't buying IB2 or Navitas. They were buying Deakin. And we moved, and it wasn't an easy move for some of the folk, because we made MIBT, not immediately, but rather than the Navitas world, it was Deakin College. Or, we moved to, and of course, understandably, I guess when Rod and Peter, when PIBT was born, the university might have been giving them the university, but not necessarily Edith Cowan College, so, and of course,
mm,
the label of PIBT, it was no longer business and technology. There was health, a range of other programs. So the IBIT didn't reflect what the college was, and it sits
what the
the
business
business
did
did
anymore?
anymore.
Yeah.
And I think the first time a university's name might have been in there in college, it was Curtin International College, I think, CIC, although it was Hartford International, HIBT and LIBT. Yes, I think the first time might have been when we had Curtin College created. And then, of course, the
Mm,
evolution from, the college to actually the managed campus, i.e. Curtin College. Sri Lanka now is with ECU, as you know. Latrobe, has got a managed campus in Sydney. Western Sydney's, managed, full on degrees. So that was a movement up the scale, if you like, Rob. Universities being confident enough, not just for the pathway, but to actually, have a similar model, if you will, royalty based, not dissimilar to a pathway, but aggregated to your university. And then, of course, as Navitas acquired SAE and ACAP, which is as now they've got university college status. So for me, sitting outside it, it's extraordinary to think of the continued evolution of what is really a great global Australian, West Australian originated company.
success
Yeah,
story. Yeah.
you bet.
Yeah.
Phenomenal.
Yeah. Extraordinary.
Phenomenal.
Sorry, this is a complete left turn, but my audience will appreciate that I take
Yeah.
this from time to time. Do you think in stories? You're a great
Yeah.
storyteller, John, and
Well,
yeah, it's just like some people, the way their brains
yeah.
work is they see everything as a story. You ask someone a
Yeah.
question, and they'll give you a story.
Well, I guess some people think I go on too bloody long and spend all the time telling a story. And it's unrelated, I guess, Rob, but because the world had been very good to me, and because of that association when I mentioned critical assessments, Christopher Helm, a publisher, and I became great friends. He loved Australia. We created Helmwood Publishers to really do guides to power in Australia. Christopher got ill. I got very busy. We didn't follow through. I kept the registration Helmwood Publishers. Christopher passed off. He funded a whole host of stuff, passed it over to me. And then one day I was terribly bored in bloody executive at ECU. I thought, I'm going to register Margaret River Press, because I built a house in the bush around Redgate, and it's a wonderful, wonderful thing to have done, and that's where I am mentally most of the time. So we registered Margaret River Press, and I was never perhaps going to get around to doing it. My wife was working in administration, Centre for Stories, Centre for Water Research at UWA, and said I was almost hoping something might happen. So Patty said, look, so she began it. And of course, you don't make any money out of publishing, Rob. So she didn't take any income. The world of Navitas was very good to me. So I was able to keep funding it. And then I thought, well, they're going to sink the railway line in Perth. We should look at trying to get a little office in Northbridge. But always with me ends up becoming much grander. So we we ended up, the government, when they sunk the railway line, there were a few buildings in great bureaucratic style they forgot to sell. One was a house built in, no one's quite sure, 1870s, 1880s maybe, that was falling into wreck and ruin, and they were selling it. And my daughter spotted it, so we bought it. I bought it, and to get it, because it was sort of a bit of an arts precinct, had been in our head for a while. We created this, that we were going to put the Centre for Stories there. And that was all about giving people. So Caroline had worked out that the publishing was very Anglo-centric. There were marginal voices, or voices that were never heard. And so how did you address that? In part, it was in part. And so we hit upon this notion of, well, let's get a building and create the Centre for Stories, and outlined in 4 or 5 paragraphs what that might be. Then, of course, we had to acquire the building and then refurbish it, knock down the back. The world of Navitas has been very good to me. So it was high risk. My financial advisor said not to do it because I'd blow every bit of super, but I ignored him and her. And so we began the Centre for Stories, which today, as it happens, is celebrating 10 years of existence. And, it's just been, anyone listening, go and have a look at centreforstories.com, the website. And would you believe, Rob, I can't believe it. Not only 10 years, but the impact we've had, the people have been through. We're now but receiving revenues, and you spend a lot. It's still touch and go, well over the $1 million mark. So many people have been through. So we refurbished the old house, knocked the back down, and then used a mixture of the containers and apartments. And that idea, if you like, was kind of revenue. One's cost, the other's revenue, in pretty simple terms. It's a great, but anyhow, and the point is, isn't it extraordinary to think we registered centreforstories.com? There's no one else in the world that's got the centreforstories.com. It might be storytelling centre. And then whilst there are often centres of literature or centres of oral storytelling, we do both. It's both oral storytelling and written storytelling. So, from Ian Potter Foundation to the Australia Council, the Old Australia Council, to government departments, to some philanthropists along the way. But, we've got to handle transition now as to, and to keep a little bit like Navitas, I guess, that essential spirit alive of what's made it. And that's very challenging when you get bigger and new people come into play, of not losing what the heart of it really is. So, but it's a great thing, because, Rob, the truth is, I don't need another shirt in life. Any of the dollars I pick up, I might as well go there, in a nutshell.
It's a beautiful thing when you allow people to share their story, to have their voice heard, because suddenly, that marginalisation becomes a little bit smaller.
It does.
Doesn't it?
And those voices aren't heard enough of. And the whole point of doing it is, in hearing those stories, one hopes there's a bit of good social change comes about. People pause and reflect that, there's a whole different series of stories out there. And we made it a point of some stage we used to have refugee dinners. And then we realized that we didn't want to hear people. Refugee stories are one thing, and perhaps I'm not articulating it very well, but to get them telling a story, not of the refugee boat or whatever, but what Christmas was like back in Ethiopia, or what it was like playing soccer, and training them to tell that story. And in fact, one very moving, we've worked through all sorts of ages, and look, I'd fail the exam about what we do. I just can't keep up, but I'm not there, I just make sure that building doesn't fall, all that sort of stuff. I say I'm just the maintenance. My son gets stuck into me because, Dad, you're more than that. But the truth is, it's got its momentum and programs and funding. One was the schools program,
That's awesome.
where one of the schools in Perth has a very large number of refugees, non-English speaking background. Some of them might have 5 or 6 languages, and of course they do struggle in English and literature. So we had a program in the school to train them to tell stories, not about a refugee, but about soccer, about family. And so they then come and present that. It's very moving. I mean, I'm almost in tears, Rob, because you listen to these kids. One of them was died. He died subsequently of cancer because he was able to be treated up to a point. But I mean, they're just telling, and so that gave them, firstly, people listening to it realize there's a life they've lost in the country that they prefer to keep living in, but they're not. Secondly, that it gave them a level of confidence to actually talk about other things. So that was just one little program, oral storytelling. Equally, in the way, often there are writing programs that just once off. Well, we get people for 3 years, mentor them, take them through. These are first time writers, and that doesn't mean they're young in inverted commas. They can be a range of ages, from an Indigenous ladies to others. And then we funded, we haven't been able to keep this going. I mean, just need dollars for the Roaring 90s, hearing the stories of people over 90. And of course, we're podcasting them and
That I
all of
love.
that. One very moving story,
Yeah.
Michael's story. Michael's father came out from a small island in Greece with one of his sons. I think Rob, I might get it so wrong. One died. Michael came out subsequently, and before he came out, his mother was very worried about it. So she went around to the village and got silver from 50 Marias. And he had this cross made out of it. Of course, survived. He go to war, I'm not sure, became a tailor, and his daughter became the headmistress of English at one of the private schools. Was he so proud? And that was then his story was turned into a play, and that play was produced. Again, there was another one of Sister Sarwood, stories of some Indian women who then we trained the people, or I didn't, but folk did, and they were then told their story. It was turned into a play, performed. And then my son conceived, because he's involved, they conceived backyard stories, trained people to tell their stories in backyards. And so X number of backyards were established, a bloody administrative nightmare to set it all up. But so it's not just the oral, it's just not the written. And that's pretty unique to actually balance that. And people are now other groups are taking it on good, bit like Navitas. People are copying the model. Why not? Successful, and that's okay. Anyhow, Rob,
You're a real
you
humanist,
reckon?
John. As you're
Yeah,
talking, like almost, yeah, absolutely. Every story that you've basically told as we've gone along has ended up like landing on a human at some point, right? And that being the sort of
yeah.
centerpiece. I really admire it. I mean, it's
Well, thank
fabulous.
you. I guess it comes from. I think my mother and father were just interested in people of whatever race, color, or religion. It just, I mean, and the human. I mean, I'm genuinely interested in people, whether I've been in situations of hospitals or whatever else. Their kind of background. I mean, there are some people who are pretty hard to manage sometimes, Rob, where you think, oh, bloody hell, you know. uh,
Yeah, you're separating. That's the thing is you're separating the management of the
yeah,
work from the human being who still has an
yeah,
interesting
no,
story, and there's probably some reason why they're shit
yeah,
at what
no.
they do. You know,
Or
so
or I mean, I just like to think there's good in everyone, although sometimes you've got to hesitate when you think of a couple of our world leaders at the moment. Just the sort of, well, they're not leaders, are they? They're bloody murderers, Putin being one.
please,
So
yeah.
I guess that, yeah. But Rob, coming back to it, fancy being born in Australia, white, to loving parents, to not on the fringe, not in one of those. In the country town I grew up in, there was the Indigenous reserve out of town a bit opposite the rubbish tip. There was an apartheid, really. So I was born white, loving parents who believed in education, the benefit of all that. And then, of course, subsequently marrying someone of Indian descent, born in Singapore to Indian parents. And then just that global experience, I guess, Rob, that international education and international education afforded. And in some ways, you could say that part of my career has been part of an international. I was an international student, and even Oxford was daunting in a way. Not. But here I was with all my degree of confidence, I guess, and being articulate, and yet still, there's some interesting transitions. So nothing like someone who comes from a village in Vietnam, who has to cope with English for X number of years, who's struggling to actually, families put them together. So it gives you a sense of proportion, I guess, Rob.
Yeah. Let me pull a couple of threads together there: higher education and storytelling, because I feel Australian higher education has a story problem. I feel like we're not telling our story the way we need to, because let's face it, universities exist for the public good, drive innovation, education, health, breakthroughs, you name it, and yet we end up back in these narrative loops. Vice chancellors overpaid, universities as businesses. We're just, I don't know, like that main message seems to be wrong in my view. What are we doing wrong, John?
God, I wish I could add.
Oh, sorry. Let me. Can I reframe that in the positive? What could we be doing better?
Well, I think your
what
point
could we be doing
of
better?
telling the story of what it means, and every now and again you'll see a bit of a campaign, won't you? You'll see, this is what Deakin did to me, or this is what X university, and I'm grateful for it. But somehow or other it misses the mark. And I think, Rob, I'm not surprised by. Well, it's been decades. I can remember Labor gets elected, Dawkins reforms and all that. The universities thought, Labor's in power, they're going to look up. But actually, they didn't have a right view. They just missed the social license way back then. Rob, who was the minister? Andrew Robb, when he was a consultant, was appointed by the AVCC to address their problems with government as a lobbyist. That then led to the concept of Universities Australia and the annual conference. So we're going back some time, but they just think they're great at lobbying government. They genuinely, this is a very broad statement from me, but they actually think, but ministers don't hold them, particularly those of the left and Labor, interestingly enough, don't have a lot of time for them. And I think the salaries are an element of it. So they've been failing to tell the story, Rob. And when you see what's going on at ANU in recent times, well, it just reinforces it. And let's give more money to childcare or preschool education, or these schools in need. So they just miss the mark. They really do miss the mark. And if you ask me, how do they address that? I wish I could sort of answer that. But you've hit it on the head. They are not telling the story and they every now and again they'll engage consultants to do it now, but it doesn't work, Rob. It's not cutting through. And they could go on. They've lost the social license. I think they've lost a lot of their social license, is my view.
And I think John, they've lost the social license because they've failed to actually tell the story effectively. I think about mining industry. If the mining industry is faced with policy or something that it doesn't like, they just get together and they say, okay, well, normally we compete. We're kind of enemies, but we're all going to drop $20 million on a public information campaign. We're going to talk about the stuff we dig out of the ground is critical for the climate change, shift, technology shift, and let's change the narrative. And I just feel like universities probably have the opportunity to do that. Maybe that academic independence, once again, people don't like being told what to do. Maybe that's the driver.
And even that academic independence is an interesting one, really, where it's become so kind of corporate at the top level. Vice chancellors and other executives don't like being challenged by the academic board. They tried to snuffle the academic board. I mean, I saw it in the world of ECU, whereby a strong vice chancellor just shut down what you and I know as dialogue, and it's not an easy one to address, Rob. And when you think, if you kind of take it at a global picture, what an extraordinary, bizarre, and appalling situation it is, where you have someone like the President of the United States threatening universities over equity policy or, not doing this research. I mean, so much for the independence. And dare I say, going back to the old world of the Brits, one of the interesting things about the Oxbridge world was that you still had, it looked like it was inefficient in some ways, the treatment of graduate students, you hear, look after yourself, that kind of thing. But there was still a great deal of what you and I would call the dialogue, the dispute, the debate, and of course, the broader responsibility to society. And, that's pretty precious. But I haven't answered it, Rob. I think it'd be a subject of you and I to drink some prune juice and martinis over. But
we're definitely going to do that.
I know, Rob.
Actually, I'm just thinking about that because the reference will be lost on people, because John and I were talking about that before we hit record. If you want to know about prune juice and martinis, you're just going to have to ask John in person next time you see him. We're going to leave that as a bit of a tease. Now, I must say, I'm very passionate. I mean, you and I are both passionate about stories, and just recently I've become very passionate about Australia's higher education story, and just think that we all have this responsibility to tell that story better. I sometimes think that if you're a political party, you get your talking points, and the talking points are A, B, C. If all of us could just stick to the script, or a big percentage of us could stick to the script and speak up when we're challenged about vice chancellors. So I'm just picking on that. Like that's not a good example, but the role of institutions and the value of institutions, then we could really drive change. And Rob, we could win back that social license.
And in fact, Rob, we did tell an interesting tale, did we not, about the Colombo plan? And that what that was and what that meant, and the leaders. We had our talking points clear, and of course we still support that in different form, but we don't tell even that little sliver of a story. I mean, I've lost pace about how much money we put together for the new Colombo plan or fellowships or whatever. But we did tell that story very well. But since then it just gets caught up in dollars somehow. It misses the richness of it all. Going back to Hawke and, why he was so supportive of it, it was about Australia's engagement. First and foremost for him, it was, okay, the universities don't get any more bloody money from us. They don't spend it wisely. And this might help them, but bugger it, they're not going to get any more. So let them work something out. But that was an element. But it was though we need to be more engaged in the world, particularly our region. What better way to do it than have students come and study here? I mean, that was his big motivation, no question at all. I heard him articulate that. I wrote it for him, and all of that. So I was there at that very momentous time. Now, he, along with everyone else, had no idea that soon there would be IBT, Navitas, all those other providers, as well as, the expansion of university numbers. Rob, as an interesting aside, it's a bit related. I can remember Millicent Poole, my VC at ECU, was under great pressure because we knocked off Murdoch with the most international. We had UWA, we had Curtin in our sights. It was part of the people who were working for me, who were great, or with me, I should say, not for me, but they were driving them. And Millicent became very worried to me, and the council were a bit worried. So I said, well, Millicent, let's do it. And I suggested it just before one council meeting that we perhaps get someone, David Phillips, I think we ended up going with, of what universities have got large international cohorts. Well, LSC then had something like, was it 82% of, it might be a little different now, were international. So, and it was still a British university. Edith Cowan, former Deputy Premier, who became Chancellor, we're at this meeting and, Millicent was umming and ahhing and, and she was looking for me to help her out. I said, well, Hendy, we've just done this, because I'd be a bit irreverent, and he was my minister once in government. I said, Hendy, LSC, right? They've got 82% international. Do you think it's a British university or not? He said, absolutely, it's English. I said, well, we could have Edith Cowan with the same number. It doesn't mean we're not an Australian university. He said, yeah, forget it. End of discussion. So I guess what he was, and of course then, Bob, no university, perhaps Curtin might have been the only one, had passed a policy of how many international students they should have, which is quite interesting. So I guess the issue becomes, can you still be a university and have no domestic, an Australian university and have very few? I think the challenge becomes when you have a discipline in business where you've got 95% from one country. Not good for the university, not good for the students. And so in a way, some of those players that have done that haven't helped the story of the internationalisation, really. I don't think. Rob, we've been going for a long while.
You know what, John? I was just thinking the storyteller in me feels like we've just closed the loop there. Well, John, this has been a huge pleasure for me, and I'm really looking forward to doing another round with you at some point in person, maybe over a glass of wine, and having another conversation and benefiting from your wonderful stories over a lifetime in higher education.
Well, hopefully, Rob, the life's going to continue a little, and lovely to communicate and talk. And I too look forward to our in-person conversation, Rob. It's as though the discussion and dialogue and chatting has only just begun, Rob. So good luck to you, and keep up the podcasts and all the great stuff you're doing. And I look forward to seeing you in the not too distant future. And thanks, Rob.
If you've enjoyed this episode of the Global Horizons podcast, consider subscribing to our newsletter. Search for Global Horizons podcast and then just pop in your email address, and that way you will never miss out on all of the critical international education news that you need to stay up to date with. This episode has been produced on Garigal land in Sydney. Our video and audio editor is Len Zamora, and I'm your host, Rob Malicki. Have an awesome day. See you in the next episode.